Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme. Whose job should it be to police what we see online? In the UK, the government's announced plans to regulate the internet, with tech company bosses potentially facing big fines, even prison. This is Roundtable. Hello from me, David Foster. Bullying, child abuse, hate speech, it is only a small proportion of what is out there online and on social media, but it can have a massive impact. So, how do you prevent harmful content without restricting speech or the freedom of the internet?
The idea of regulating the internet has long been thought of as all but impossible. Billions of pages of content, millions more added every day. But the rise in harmful material online has prompted the UK government to give the broadcast regulator Ofcom new powers to police what is posted on the internet. Ofcom will have powers to combat harmful and illegal content, with company bosses potentially facing fines or even prison. However, critics say the addition of new rules and regulations could stifle free speech and effectively give the government unprecedented powers to decide what is posted online. UK campaign group Big Brother Watch has called the plans a direct attack on the fundamental right to freedom of expression. But even Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg has suggested new rules for the internet. The company and other social networks have faced criticism for the kinds of content they allow to be published on their platforms. Other countries have their own systems to police the internet. Are we entering a new phase of internet regulation?
And I'm very pleased to say that joining me at the round table today we have Ray Walsh, a digital privacy expert from the campaign group Pro Privacy. Julia Hornley is with us, Professor of Internet Law from Queen Mary University in London. Kevin Poulter here too, partner and employment lawyer at Freeth Solicitors with a special interest in social media. And Aidan White, the president of the Ethical Journalism Network. Warm welcome to each and every one of you. Ray, let me come to you first of all. Depraved, corrupt, hideous, a lot of the stuff that's designed to be covered by these new laws. What is wrong with that? You think there's a real danger in this?
Well, for me, the real danger is that when we do give a regulatory body the power to censor the internet, there is a potential that that power could be abused in the future. And so even though we can all agree that there's certain things that probably do need regulating, it's about making sure that any regulation that we do have is very specific so that there's no wiggle room that allows the government to then put pressure on Ofcom and potentially censor things that are in the national interest.
It is very difficult, though, when you're talking about freedom of speech here, to know what is likely to deprave or corrupt, to use old legal language when it came to pornography, I think it was. What is likely to be upsetting, what is likely to influence people to criminal acts, isn't it? It's not just a dangerous image, it's not just something nasty, it could be something that is said. So how do you do that?
Well, that's the thing. The problem with the online harms white paper, as I see it, is that even though some of the things that are within that proposed documentation is all the kind of stuff we would want taken down, there's plenty of other things in there which just seem to be too broad. And so how do we know that Ofcom is going to be able to make those decisions? It's going to be able to decide what is disinformation, what is extremist, because what's extremist to one person isn't necessarily extremist to the next person. And so giving just this one regulatory body the power to make those decisions would seem quite dangerous.
Doesn't it seem a little bit odd that we have to talk about the internet as a separate entity when we have laws covering all of these things in the public domain anyway?
The problem there, I think, is that in many ways the police can't enforce all the laws all the time, partly because user-generated content is distributed across the world. So the actual user posting the material could well be in another country. So I think the jurisdictional challenge here causes real problem for enforcement. But coming back to a point you were saying, the other issue, I think, is that the most violent content, even though shocking, offensive, is not necessarily the most dangerous content. So if you think in terms of creating, radicalization, terrorists, it's not necessarily the pictures which I and you would perhaps condemn most, but it's actually the subversive influence which you and I might not understand.
But Julie, I mean, you're an expert in law. Do we not have laws in this country that say if you print something like that, if you publish it in another way than on the internet, then you will be in trouble with the law. And could not those regulations, laws, be applied to this?
So the government at the moment is also looking at whether the criminal law should be changed. And the big question here is whether what's illegal offline should also be illegal online. That, as a principle, of course, makes sense. I think the problem is that people behave differently online from the way they behave offline.
But they'd learn pretty quickly, wouldn't they, if the same law applied and they were banged up for doing something that was illegal in daily life if they did it on the internet?
Absolutely. The distinction to make is that some of the laws we're talking about are archaic. They are very old 19th century laws that are being reinterpreted over centuries to take us to where we are today. There's a need for clearer regulation and legislation in that sense. But there's also the risk, of course, with online that people can be anonymous. They can represent themselves through other parties. They can go through proxy servers. They can hide, which you can't necessarily or easily do in real life.
Well, then we will get on in just a little while to people who are hiding behind these cloaks of anonymity and whether, in fact, the publisher, the provider, should be the one that faces justice, if you like. But Aidan, you're itching to say something, I know.
Look, there's a massive problem. There's a tsunami of abuse which is actually present. People are at risk. Vulnerable groups are at risk. A major report by the Global Threat Assessment last year said there were record levels of abuse that affect children and vulnerable groups and so on. Everyone recognises the need for regulation. Even the tech companies are calling for regulation. And the fact of the matter is, how do we start it? How do we begin the process instead of wringing hands about a problem which no one has come up with a satisfactory legal solution to? The question of Ofcom is actually straightforward. In Britain, for example, Ofcom is a perfectly respected regulator. It's a state institution. It was set up, as a state institution. It's underpinned by law, but it's highly respected by journalists and others that are subject to it. And Ofcom is an important body because it not only does it set standards, it seeks to provide research, which is important, which talks about the developments.
I should say that Ofcom, just for those in other countries and different parts of Britain who don't understand it, is the broadcasting regulator in this country, the Office of Communication.
But basically what I want to say here is that Ofcom is perfectly fit for purpose, it seems to me, as a recognisable public entity to be called into play here. Now, of course, there's no question at all that there's got to be clearer definition of what the role will be.
But I think
there's also got to be clearer definition of the powers.
Can I ask Ray what he would do?
If
you think this stuff shouldn't be out there, what would you do?
Well, I accept your point, and that Ofcom seems fit for purpose to you. My point is that, in actual fact, Ofcom, the board of Ofcom are selected. There's a few members. Those members are selected by the Secretary of State for Digital, Media, Culture and Sports. And that Secretary of State is chosen by the Prime Minister. And so over time, there is actually a potential for the government to actually have influence and to cherry pick those members. And if that happens, then further down the line, what we consider, reasonable and acceptable forms of censorship now could devolve.
But there's no evidence to support that. That's an irrational fear.
I absolutely disagree.
it's not an irrational
I absolutely disagree because
no evidence of Ofcom.
Could I just say that judges are appointed, police officers are appointed. What is the difference here?
Well,
the difference is that the content cannot be individually regulated anymore. I don't know how many hours of video are being... Can I finish my point?
Broadcast content is regulated.
Broadcast content is fundamentally different to user-generated content. User-generated content cannot be regulated in the same way. And that's recognised by the government in the white paper.
But social media has caught everyone on the hop. Broadcasting regulation has been in place for decades, and it's grown up and evolved over time. Ofcom, it regulates everything from the TV and the press, like you say, right the way through to the postal service. What do you think makes it appropriate in itself, as it stands, to regulate social media or to regulate the internet? I don't think it is. I think you're right.
Look, I don't think it is appropriate as it is, but it clearly has to adjust and adapt and to change and to recognise the new culture of communications that exists. But it seems to me the idea that we can proceed leaving things as they are without proper intervention in defence of public interest.
But no one is
seems
saying
to me,
that.
but
no one is
coming
saying
up
that.
with.
So the argument here is not, should we not regulate, should we just sit back and watch all of this happening? That is not the argument. The argument is something much more sophisticated. The question is, how should we regulate, not whether we should
course.
regulate.
Well, let's ask Ray. Do you think that is the argument? How we do it, not whether we should
Definitely,
do it?
I absolutely
But
agree.
you think the platforms are doing a good enough job of
I
regulating
certainly-
themselves? I mean, the fact the stuff is out there clearly indicates
I
that
certainly
they're
do
not.
think it is easier to regulate the independent, you know, bodies than it is to actually necessarily give one, you know, the medicine might not necessarily be to give one body the power to regulate everything. And we need to make sure that if we are going to give that power to one body, that there's plenty of oversight and that there's plenty of specifics.
And I think the other concern is false expectations here. So the government wants to keep us safe online. Obviously, that's a very worthy endeavour. But I think we create false expectations. Can we be safe online? And I think if people are aware that there are dangers lurking out there and that some of the responsibility, it's not just the government's responsibility, it's also media literacy, etc., which are equally important.
I agree with that, as is the need for the government to invest heavily in media literacy, to really intervene in terms of trying to influence public understanding of the new communications culture and their responsibility to each other and the way that they communicate with one another. That's clearly part of it. But I really do want to get back to this sort of question. I think on the question of regulation and responsibility, it's clear that the tech companies have a massive responsibility. It's clear also that they need to be held to account for that. Now, in Europe, the European Union has agreed a code of conduct with the tech companies and is holding them to account for that. And what happens
Is a code of conduct something that is just sort of, we'd rather you didn't do this, or is it enforceable with massive fines or jail?
The European Union has already, for other reasons, competition rules and so on, fined the tech companies billions of
that's
euros.
competition law,
I
that's
understand
not
that,
really
but the point about it is,
content.
it shows that there is a legal capacity to impose financial penalties.
And the European Union is not imposing fines. That's
and
not true.
If I can just finish the point that I want to make, they are not imposing fines, but what they are doing is that they are holding the tech companies to account and warning them
It's
that
self-regulation.
that if they do not,
That is
it is
factually
self-regulation.
not correct.
If-
It is self-regulation. So
if-
these
can I-
technology companies write the code.
You'll have a time in a minute. Jim,
Yes,
I promise.
can I finish? The European Union has reached an agreement with the tech companies whereby they have agreed a code of conduct that will be followed. The European Union has put into place a timetable for reporting back on how those companies are fulfilling their obligations
I'm
and duties. And they have made it very clear, if the tech companies don't come up to the mark, they will be prepared to make legal intervention.
Okay, so it's not just a handshake between
Absolutely.
gentlemen. Let me ask you, do you not see this perhaps as a backdoor way to say to journalists, hang on, we're now going to say that what you're saying actually is not appropriate, it's not right, and that it's not just for the hideous, the depravity, the corrupting, etc., etc. It could be used to clamp down.
Look, I understand that very well. I've spent, 25 years of my working life actually dealing with governments that are doing precisely that. Of course, there's always a danger. But journalism is also about reflecting a public interest and about identifying harm and seeking solutions to problems when they arise. And this is a classic example of a generalized potential harm to society. Now, one of the problems that we've got is that in order to be able to deal with the problem of, for instance, online abuse, we need to know the extent of it and the impact that online communications has and the harm it causes. One of the difficulties that we have, and a researcher and the universities will know this very well, is access to data that will help us better understand what's going on. And one of the problems is the tech companies have very strong secretive rules which mean they do not share important data about algorithms and about who's using their systems. As a result of that,
We must let
But
these
can
two
we-
take part in the discussion as well. So Ray, just throw something in about what you've just heard.
Yeah, I mean, I can totally see where you're coming from, and I can see that there is regulation is immensely important, and whether I haven't got all the answers, and whether self-regulation is the only answer, I don't know. But what I can say is that the platforms themselves, we've seen similar regulations coming in overseas. We've seen similar bodies being given similar powers to the ones we're about to give Ofcom. And when that happens, almost without fail, those countries use those powers to censor for political gain in order to
Are you
silence...
talking about
talking
China
about
or
Germany?
No, I'm talking about...
Germany, because they've got a new law in?
Did that happen in Germany?
I believe it might have. It's happened
Germany
in
has-
Singapore, it's happened in...
No, it didn't happen in Germany.
But Germany has completely different law. Germany limits the regulation to criminal law, not to any other form of
Fines of
harmful
up to
content. So it's something
50, fines of up to
completely
50
different.
million in Germany.
But only criminal law, no
But
other.
certainly in Singapore, in Turkey, in Vietnam, we are seeing these kinds of problems, and it could rear its head here. And so we just need to be sure that that censorship can't be used for political means.
Okay, so it's something we'll keep an eye on.
I think you're right. I agree that self-regulation, I think it is working. YouTube, I think, took down almost 9 million videos in 3 months before they were even published, pretty much.
But they put up about 9 million every 2 minutes.
Whatever it might be, but they're taking it seriously. Yeah. They've got 10,000 people, we're going to talk about algorithms in a bit, but they've got 10,000 people taking things down, reviewing things. Facebook have got 35,000 people doing
is
this.
a fraction of
It's a
the numbers that
fraction,
are needed.
yeah.
And how many do Ofcom have?
Well, but the point I'm making
This is the issue. They don't have resource. The country doesn't have resource to fund a whole team of people to
Actually,
review
this is an
videos on a
interesting
daily
point.
basis.
How would Ofcom get to know what was out there?
Ofcom,
By
Ian?
reporting of individuals, as it happens already, through to the social media platforms themselves. We're putting in place a middleman, which surely is just going to slow things down rather than speed them up.
No.
We know that the government's not particularly quick at dealing with
But
things.
Ofcom wants
I don't think it's going to improve.
Just to be
I want to make
correct
this
here,
more international as well, if we may, rather than just talking about the UK and Ofcom.
Ofcom wants to use self-regulation as complementary to regulation.
Absolutely.
So it's not one or the other. So under the Ofcom plan, it's both. Having said that, who says that self-regulation is kinder to freedom of speech? I mean, there was this hoo-ha a while ago that Facebook, for example, didn't allow images of breastfeeding on Facebook.
Absolutely.
So who says
Artworks,
that
famous artworks are blocked out.
Nudity.
And we need to, absolutely needs to be corrected. But this shows you the examples that with 30,000
So the only way,
people, they can't
the
do it
only
right.
way to get this
How do we
sorted
do
on
it?
an international basis and on a content basis is to come up with some form of artificial intelligence which is going to know, because somebody somewhere will have told it or it will have worked it out for itself because it's that clever, what is right, what is wrong, what shouldn't be there, what should be there. And that sort of thing isn't beyond the wit of man or
at the
machine, is
moment
it?
it is. I think
Come on, one at a
think
time.
the artificial intelligence at the moment is nowhere near yet of recognizing the content which
But it's
should be prevented.
exponential, isn't it? I mean, what was impossible a week ago
I mean,
has
maybe
already
in 20
happened.
years. So I'm not saying it will never,
Well,
ever be that. I don't know. I'm not a predictor of the
I
future.
think
But what I do at the moment is they take down photographs which are already known to be illegal content. And I understand that technology works quite well. So if something already has been identified as illegal, it can be taken down. Photographs.
And the reason for that is financial, it's commercial, because these things are copyright issues usually. And you've got the big Hollywood studios, you've got whoever else, fashion designers. They are the ones who are holding the social media platforms to account by saying, if you don't take it down, we're going to come after you. This is the real issue. It's driven by money, not by keeping people safe.
I couldn't agree with you more that actually the most important influencer on the technology companies actually has been advertisers. Big company advertising has been withdrawn from being associated with when advertising has been placed in the wrong place and so on. And suddenly the tech companies have sprung into action, as though inspired. Suddenly they find solutions to these problems.
The other problem with these algorithms and why they're not fit for purpose is because actually algorithms are only ever as good as the data you use to train them up. And so they can actually be immensely prejudiced and discriminatory. Yeah. And so it's very important.
Well, there's a means of presumably making them not do what you want them to do.
Well, no, because the way, data is so varied, and unless you actually know what the discriminatory data is within those data sets, when you use massive data sets, sometimes what comes out is just an artificial intelligence algorithm that isn't necessarily perfect at doing what you want it to do.
Can I just quote Geoffrey Howard here? He's from the University College London, who wrote an interesting letter that was published today, which said, suppose Ofcom were to follow the definition used in the government's prevent strategy in this country, whereby speech critical of British values, such as democracy, counts as extremist. That is already being used by the prevent strategy. Would social media companies, by violating their duty of care then, if they fail to limit distribution of this, these are philosophical arguments, be challenging the wisdom of democratic rule, would they go to jail? It's so difficult, isn't it?
It is difficult. Just imagine a picture of an operation. At the moment, artificial intelligence cannot distinguish between a beheading and a picture of an operation. That's what it cannot do the job at this point in time. It cannot recognize irony, satire, someone criticizing something which is related to terrorism.
Which is effectively what he was saying.
Exactly, yeah.
Getting that, you've said it already, the clarity. And the clarity needs to come from democracy. It needs to come from Parliament. We need to have some sort of border line of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And if Germany are working on the what's lawful and what's not lawful...
Is this not where the
it's
online
right place to
harms
be.
paper comes into it?
Well, it
which
should
you
be.
consulted upon?
I mean, the online harm paper, I think, sort of was important because it revealed a very strong and deep public anxiety. I think there's no doubt at all that there's going to be a hybrid form of self-regulation, statutory regulation, in which it'll be trial and error, in which there will be an attempt to have, through Ofcom, because I think it's the obvious body, to sort of reach an agreement with tech companies about their responsibilities in an EU-style sort of working arrangement. Then there'll be monitoring and so on and so forth.
You may remember back, and you probably do, back in, I think it was probably 1969, the Oz Obscenity trial. Magazine in this country, Richard Neville, went to jail for publishing something that was deemed to be offensive and pornographic. Are we going to end up with, and he was considered eventually to be a martyr, will we end up with the same sort of supposedly show trials in which these sorts of judgments are eventually tested, do you think?
I'm not sure. I think the greater danger is that the government, because it cannot do anything else, will use artificial intelligence, which is not suited to its job. So things will be taken down which should stay up, which are perfectly legal, and other things which are illegal and which are dangerous will stay up. And people obviously use privacy-enhancing technologies, virtual private networks, that get around all the controls.
And there'll be meltdown.
This will push the responsibility back onto the social media platforms who may be able to be responsible, which pushes it onto, yes, AI and the algorithms checking these things, but also a lot of individuals who will be in fear of losing their jobs if they don't take something down that they should have taken down, which leads back to the censorship point, that we've got individuals sat who are working computers saying this is acceptable, this isn't, without any
You've got
care
to
for the
be King
regulation
Solomon
law,
really in all of
but
this,
looking
haven't
after their own
you?
job.
To make the right decision, and we don't know how that ended up.
The online harms paper, as it is at the moment, is just far too broad, and some of the things that it mentions, such as like takedown requests, could happen for national security reasons, or could happen because there's content that goes against our democratic ideals and principles, and that just seems very vague. And for me, I just feel that leaves much too much wiggle room.
It's not vague if there's evidence, for example, about external interference in democratic national elections. These aren't academic questions. There's lots of evidence of what are traditionally regarded as important democratic values being undermined by the illicit and abusive use of technology, communication technology. And so therefore it's right for us to have a look at this and to say, is there a different way of doing it?
This is what I was wondering, because time's limited, and you excuse me for being so rude, but I'm wondering whether, in fact, it's almost impossible to pick up something vile that is in a swimming pool if it's the size of a grain of sand. But as the water went into the swimming pool, you might be able to check it at source. Isn't that the answer? That rather than examining everything that's already out there, you make sure that it doesn't get out there in the first place?
You're talking about monitoring. Yeah. Look, this is the big problem, because the real problem is the scale of uploading of information and so on. No one, and everyone accepts, that no one is able to control it. No one is able to monitor it in the way that you're talking about. Now, one of the advantages, and there may have been difficulties about what Germany did in terms of its legislation and so on, but one of the things that Germany did, which was very, very important, is that it helped Facebook to recognize that it was no use having a couple of thousand people monitoring what was being uploaded in Germany. They needed to double, treble, quadruple the number of human beings available monitoring material. And this is where the tech companies need to have salt put on their tail. They need to invest far more in monitoring data as it's being uploaded.
Absolutely.
This is back down to the individual.
It's difficult, but it's not impossible.
It's not impossible.
Because you then say you can't put as much up there.
The social media companies, as you rightly pointed out, have actually reacted by actually, upping their game, employing more moderators, developing technologies. But I still think that the problem as such, it's just a question of scale. Okay, we have double the amount of moderators now, which is better, I guess, but it doesn't solve the problem at source. And I think that's
you put in place laws that says, look, you cannot make money by putting stuff out there that is unfiltered. What you have to do is check, first of all, that it's okay. Then you can put it out there. And
as a journalist, how happy will you be if you're told, well, I want to send a tweet now.
I don't tweet. I
want to upload a video, whoever it might be. I want
person.
to upload a live video. You're going to have to wait for 5 minutes, 10 minutes until it's been reviewed.
Aidan, we did that, didn't we?
Look, we did.
We waited, and the news was no worse for it.
The problem about it is the business imperatives behind the exploitation of communications technology are such that it is the promotion of clickbait, it is the promotion of attention seeking within the public at large, and that inevitably means if there's no clear commitment to a duty of care and investment in moderation about material that's being put up, it inevitably means that vulnerable people will suffer. And that's why the tech companies have to be held to account.
And these tech companies are as powerful as nations these days, and if they can't be held to account because...
Precisely.
Who can? Listen, thank you. Thank you very, very much indeed. Been great. Cheers. Thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable. Who polices the internet? Who appoints the policemen or women, and what powers do they have? Is that censorship or is that simple common sense? You make your own mind up. Thank you for watching. I'm David Foster. See you next time, I hope. Bye-bye.